Hello, welcome to Introduction to the Hebrew Bible, session 52. I was telling the early service and encouraging them to join us. I started this during the pandemic, but I had too many things to say, so I couldn't get done before the pandemic. So here we are, still pushing through now to the book of Ecclesiastes. And I am recording this online, so we'll put it up on YouTube for those who couldn't make it, as is our custom. Also, we've got a couple of people joining us online as well, Nancy Collins and Melissa Branderhorst. So Nancy and Melissa, feel free to unmute yourself or shout if you have something you want to say. But we will dive right in. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, the fountain of all wisdom, you know our necessities before we ask and our ignorance in asking. Have compassion on our weakness and mercifully give us those things which for our unworthiness we dare not, and for our blindness we cannot ask. Through the worthiness of your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So we're going to remind us of our suggested text that we work with. We always start with our version of the Bible that I like, the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha, because we're not dirty Protestants. That's a joke. Sorry, love you, Protestants. And How to Read the Bible, book by book. Great Protestant book, ironically enough, by Fee and Stewart, but a really good one-book summation. And the book I use specifically for today, the book of Ecclesiastes, is the commentary by William Brown on Ecclesiastes in the Interpretation series. You may be catching a theme here, that almost without fail, when I'm turning to a specific book, on any text of the Bible, I move to the interpretation series. If you're not familiar with that series, it's a great commentary. It's particularly good. I like it because it's written for preaching and teaching, and it does a really good job not only providing excellent academic analysis of the text, but connecting it consistently in every section to the life we live. It's a great commentary series. I was able to purchase the whole series through some wonderful Lilly Grant money when I was an intern back in the day. They had money left over in the budget, and they're like, would you like to do anything with that? And I came up with a list of like $1,500 worth of books I wanted to buy that I could never afford on my own. And they said, sure, because it's the Lilly endowment and they don't care. And I was like, what? Oh, order. And that's why I have such a nice library out there. Thank you, Eli Lilly Pharmaceuticals. All right, let's review a little, though, from our last class. Our last class we did was the book of Proverbs, hence the wisdom prayer I used at the beginning of this class. In the Hebrew Bible, there are 3 clear examples of wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible. Does anyone know what they are? One of them's kind of a gimme. Well, 2 of them, perhaps. Job, great. Proverbs, there it is. Gee, I wonder what the other one might be. Ecclesiastes, there you go. Thank you, Mac. Great. Psalms, I heard. Psalms is poetry, but you get a half point because there are wisdom psalms. So portions of the Psalter are indeed classified as wisdom literature. Additionally, though, in the deuterocanonical texts, there are 2 more wisdom books. Double points if any of you know these. I should use this at a trivia night, right? Ben Sirach. One more. Ecclesiasticus. Well, that is Ben Sirach. Wisdom of Solomon, which is absolutely not written by Solomon. It's a Hellenistic book of literature. But Wisdom of Solomon, which is different than Proverbs, different than Song of Solomon. This is in the deuterocanonical text. But those are the 2 that are there as well. Let's talk about some characteristics of wisdom literature. One of the things that's really important to note when you read wisdom literature in the Bible is it's distinct from the rest of the Old Testament. All of those things that are distinctively Israelite or Jewish are often absent from wisdom literature. Do any of you remember what there's no mention of in wisdom literature, which is kind of a bizarre thing for the Bible? God sometimes. God's there, but in a different sort of way. There's no mention of the promise of the patriarchs, which is kind of a huge part of the rest of the Old Testament. No mention of Exodus or Moses, which is like that's the grounding narrative. Wisdom literature doesn't talk about it. No mention of the covenant in Sinai, once again grounding to the Jewish faith. No mention of King David, which is kind of bizarre as well. Wisdom does not represent the action of God in Israel's history, which is how we usually think of the Old Testament, the actions of God in Israel's history. Instead, wisdom deals with daily human experience in the good world God has created. That's what the wisdom is about. And so when you read wisdom literature, you have to read it differently than the way we read other parts of the Hebrew Bible, which is a helpful reminder not only for remembering about the Proverbs, but also for the text we're going to be doing today. A little more review, see what people can remember here. In the first verse of the book of Proverbs, we're given a picture of what wisdom is about. I'm sure everyone remembers that to a T, right? No clue, no idea. We're reminded at the outset that wisdom is not about living the good life, but living a life that is righteous, justice, and marked with equity. We see that right at the beginning of Proverbs. This is what wisdom is. It's not about, I want to learn to be wise so that I can live my best life now. It's so I can live a life that is marked by righteous, justice, and equity. Only a couple more, and then we'll push through. The most of wisdom literature and Proverbs that people are familiar with are the wise sayings of Solomon. That's actually only one part of the book of Proverbs, but it's what a lot of people know. Rather than seeing the Proverbs as aphorisms for all time, instead we should see these. Does anyone remember how we should see them differently? It's not like if you read it in Proverbs, this is always true. How does it function instead? Anyone remember? Deeply contextual. The observation of wisdoms in certain contexts that may not always make sense in another context. And of course, I've got my favorite example of that, which is Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5. Verse 4, which says, do not answer fools according to their folly, or you'll become a fool yourself. Have any of you been in an instance that that context made sense? Like, don't, this person is saying such foolish stuff. If you even try to engage with it, you're going to look like an idiot, right? So that's one context. But then the next verse says, answer fools according to their folly, or they will be wise in their own eyes. That there are times, now have you ever had those situations where you've needed to speak up and say something, right? So it's not that you just kind of pick a verse of the Bible and follow it. That's actually never the case, to be honest with you. But it's what does the context I'm in demand? And I think this is a particularly helpful thing to remember in such a divided climate as the one we live in right now. That there will be times and moments when you should just be quiet, and it's fine. Just don't even engage the crazy. And that there are times and moments where you must engage the crazy. You have to say something is wrong. Wisdom is learning which is which for what time. That's what wisdom literature is doing. All right, so yeah, which is true. Depends on the context. All right, let's talk about any comments on Proverbs before we dive into Ecclesiastes. All right, let's dive into Ecclesiastes. Begins the words of Kohelet, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith Kohelet, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. This right here is a screenshot of the Tanakh translation of the Tanakh by the JPS. If you are ever looking for a good study Bible on the Old Testament, in addition to the New Oxford and Annotated, I highly commend you the Jewish Publication Society Tanakh. Their translation of the Hebrew scriptures is a little different than what you'll see in the New Revised Standard Version. I will often turn to it when I'm dealing with a thorny text because I don't know, maybe the way Jewish people who actually talk in Hebrew regularly would translate Hebrew might be better than the way a bunch of white European scholars want to translate Hebrew, right? And so it's a really helpful translation to have. You can get an English version. I have an interlinear version from when I was studying Hebrew, and that's what this is a screenshot of, where it literally gives me the English on one side and the Hebrew on the other side. So you get Debari, the words, Kohelet, Ben David, Melech, so son of David, king, ben Jerusalem, in Jerusalem. So I can still a little Hebrew. Look at that. It helps in the translations right here, though. So that's kind of how it starts. And I want to start there because one of the first questions people have with Ecclesiastes is who wrote it. You sort of assume Solomon, but as is often the case when I talk to you about the Bible, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. So the name of the book in the Jewish scriptures is it's named by the person who wrote it. So in Hebrew, that word is Kohelet. And that's the Hebrew word again right there. Remember, Hebrew in ancient texts didn't have vowels. So those dots right there, those are the vowels. These are the consonants. So that's O, ko, that's a sound, EH, ko, he, let. But this is what it actually looks like in manuscripts without the vowels. The vowels were added later in the Masoretic time. So that's the way you'll see it. And then this is, of course, the text with all the vowels in it. But Kohelet is the author. Word means assembler, gatherer. It's kind of what that word means. And how we translate Kohelet is one of the first enigmatic things about the book of Ecclesiastes. So Luther translated Kohelet as preacher. He once said that the act of preaching entailed throwing oneself in the way of Satan's many teeth, which probably doesn't make anyone want to sign up for a preaching class. But his thought was this person, that what a preacher does is a preacher assembles or gathers the community. They gather the wisdom, the insights of Scripture. They gather, that's what a preacher is, kind of a gathering person, which is to me a really kind of a beautiful image for preacher. I think, at least. In the Septuagint, the translators translated the word in ancient Greek using the word Ecclesiastes, which refers to a member of an assembly. Ecclesia, right, is a gathering of people. That's what the word church comes from, Ecclesiastes. So it's a member of an assembly. That word then transliterated into Latin became the book's title of the Christian tradition. So we call it Ecclesiastes, not because it has anything to do with the church, but because of that connection to the Greek word ecclesia, the calling together of an assembly, right? From literally, ecclesia is ek, out of, and it's kaleo, to call out, ecclesia. And so that's how they translated Kohelet, kind of that literal translation of assembler, assembly, Ecclesiastes. Or you could do the more, what does the word actually mean, which Luther thinks is probably more like preacher. Or teacher is another way that you'll see it translated often. The Kohelet is the teacher. Or sometimes scholars will just leave it untranslated, which is a fun thing to do when a word's hard to translate, and which is often the case in Hebrew. One thing I remember I learned when I was studying Hebrew is if you're ever reading in the Bible, you see a footnote and it says meaning of Hebrew uncertain. That does mean they have no idea what that word means. They're just guessing here. That happens a lot of times in the Hebrew scriptures because it's a dangerous language. The modern Hebrew, you have to remember, is different than biblical Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is actually the first time an ancient language was resurrected and put into modern use. Because of course the Jewish people weren't speaking Hebrew for a long time, right? It was only biblical Hebrew. So that's an interesting thing. So yeah, it's a tricky word, Kohelet, to translate. Probably preacher, teacher, though, is the best way of doing it. I also think, though, if you think of it, in terms of what the word means, gatherer, one who gathers together, that's also a beautiful understanding of what it means to be a teacher, right? You're someone who assembles students, then you assemble ideas together with your students. It's this bringing together of things that they're trying to do. So who wrote it then? Well, I'm not sure still. Solomon is never named explicitly. He's indirectly named. This is actually one of the only mentions of David in wisdom literature, as this son of David, king in Jerusalem. Remember, though, that Ben David, son of David, does not always mean literal child of David, but can mean from the generations of David. So anyone in the Davidic line could be son of David. That's the Messiah is the son of David, right? And clearly he's not literally David's kid. So often attributed to Solomon, but that's not really there clearly in the text. The postscript in chapter 12 describes him as a teacher rather than a king, using a different Hebrew word. And so that royal persona that we have in the beginning of the text could be more rhetorical than historical. That's a possibility. This could have been a teacher who is somehow related to David or is adopting that persona. It could be a teacher in the royal court. We just don't know for sure. It's kind of unclear. Ancient rabbinic writings describe a lot of debates among Jewish leaders surrounding Ecclesiastes. Some affirm Ecclesiastes, insisting that Solomon did write it and he was divinely inspired by writing it. Other rabbinic leaders, though, sought to suppress the book of Ecclesiastes because it encouraged hedonism and smacked of heresy, they believed. And so there's actually a lot of debate about whether or not Ecclesiastes should be a book authentically included in the Jewish canon of Scripture. You get a lot of ancient rabbinic debate about that. And it's interesting to me that those who affirmed the inclusion of Ecclesiastes did so based upon their belief of an ascription to Solomon. So who wrote it? We're not any closer. Despite its traditional associations with Solomon, most scholars these days would date Ecclesiastes to sometime during the late Persian and early Hellenistic period. So somewhere between 450 and 250 BC. That's kind of a big chunk of time. But that kind of is around when people sort of think it. One of the reasons for that is in Ecclesiastes, there's a presence of two Persian loan words. So words that are in the Persian language that are transliterated and used in the Hebrew here. That's what when one language borrows from another language. And so if the author of a Hebrew book called Ecclesiastes is borrowing from the Persian language, very likely this was written when the time when the Persian Empire was dominant or had recently been dominant. That's one reason people think of it. A lot of the grammatical characteristics of the Hebrew is much more reflective of post-exilic writing, so writings written after the exile, after people returned from the exile in Babylon. So that also suggests it's written after the rise of Persian rule across the Southwest Asia. That was 539 BC when Persia kind of took over. So once again, that kind of gives us a sense of when it is. At the same time, there's the absence of Greek loan words that you would generally expect in later texts. And so that leads some to say that it has to be before Alexander the Great's conquest of the Levant. So this is still when Persia is the dominant entity. This is before the Greek Empire took over, if you remember your ancient world history. So these are the ways scholars figure out when a book is written. It's actually kind of interesting. It's you can use the grammar, the way it's written, kind of suss out some of these questions. So who wrote the book? This is becoming a long answer to what should be a very easy question. The frequent mentions of a volatile economy, intermittent interruptions in landholding by authorities, and concerns about inheritance suggest a time of profound economic and cultural change. That does fit with the late Persian and early Hellenistic periods into ancient Near East. So the kind of volatility, economic volatility, social volatility comes to justice, and also the volatility of a deep questioning of belief systems. Because if you think of ancient Judaism being this kind of country on its own, kind of it's us against the world, and then you think of the experience of the way that Judaism was shaped by the leaders of Judaism spending 70 years in Babylon, surrounded by Babylonian religion, while a lot of the rest of Jews are in exile in Egypt, surrounded by Egyptian religion, and then they come back when the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and then they're sent back. So now they're being exposed to Persian ideas, and then you have the rise of Greece happening not far from them, the import of Greek ideas. So you start questioning what you've always thought about your religion after that kind of world upheaval. And we often forget because history is history, so you just read about it in a book. But this was a time of profound social, religious, philosophical upheaval, this era in world history. It was a huge tipping point. We are living in a very scary time. I'm sorry, I don't think we compare to this period in history very closely. But there's a lot of that kind of wrestling, and what you get in Ecclesiastes, you get the sense that whoever is writing this, that they are wrestling very hard with what it means to believe in God, to be a person of God, what even wisdom looks like in this crazy, frustrated world that we live in. The earliest manuscript fragment of Ecclesiastes is actually one of the oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you're not familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls, these were found in the 20th century in caves near the Qumran community. And when they were discovered, they blew the academic world away because we did not have manuscripts that old by hundreds of years. And so when we got these, it's amazing. This one particular is a scroll of the book of Ecclesiastes. They've dated it to almost 200 years before the time of Christ, which is kind of, to have a piece of paper that old is amazing. And so when you think, so when is Ecclesiastes written? It has to be at least that old, because it, of course, by that point had been written and copied and passed around a little bit. So that's kind of the deadline for the latest at which it could have been written, probably sometime in the 2nd, 3rd century. So who wrote it? Dang it all. This is all I'm going to do today, isn't it? Is tease you about who did or did not write it. The Talmud actually claims Hezekiah and his scribes were responsible for Ecclesiastes. That actually is a pretty good thesis if you think about it. So Hezekiah was a faithful king towards the end of the monarchy who did a lot to kind of resurrect Judaism from a time of corruption. Also, though, was doing that while engaging with world transition. So Hezekiah is a son of David. He's a Davidic king. So that's kind of a really interesting thesis that the Talmud has. So that's a possibility, actually, Hezekiah. Rabbinic literature overwhelmingly presents the book, usually though, as a product of Solomon's later years after he repented of his idolatry and became disillusioned with life. So if you remember the story of Solomon, kind of becomes king when he's very young. God asks him what he wants in a vision, and he says, I want wisdom. And God told him, because you didn't ask for wealth or power or anything like that, I'll give you wisdom and wealth and power. And he was a profoundly wise figure in the Jewish scriptures. But he also kind of lost his way. He had something like hundreds of wives and concubines, and they all drew him into all of these foreign gods and everything. So the theory in rabbinic scholarship is that after that, towards the end of his life, he became deeply disillusioned with the idolatry he'd been a part of, with the life he'd lived, with the power he thought he'd had, the wisdom he thought he had. It all kind of didn't really matter anymore. Who knows if that's it's probably not accurate. But I think that's a really beautiful kind of symbolic way of looking at this book. What an interesting idea is to picture Solomon at that stage of his life. After having written the magnificent Proverbs. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis, who wrote beautiful texts. One of my least favorite book by C.S. Lewis is Mere Christianity. I think it's lame. I'm very unpopular for that. One of my other least favorite books by C.S. Lewis is The Problem of Pain. Pain is God's megaphone to rouse a blah, blah, blah world. That's what C.S. He wrote these really thoughtful, intelligent things about suffering. And then he got married, and then his wife had cancer. No, that was where The Problem of Pain was after that one, where it wasn't pain as God's metaphor. It was you go to God when it's hard, and you hear the sound of the door locking on the other side. And the problem of pain is this deep meditation of loss of God. And whenever I encounter people in deep grief, I don't have them read his apologetics about suffering. I have them read his own experience in the problem of pain. And so I think you kind of see this that similar way, that you kind of engage philosophically with these questions, but when you've been disillusioned by it all, you're going to write differently. So that's a possibility. One medieval Jewish tradition suggests that God took the throne from the elderly Solomon, who then wrote Ecclesiastes while struggling and homeless. This is what I love about rabbinic midrash, is they come to these great ideas of re-understanding text. What another kind of interesting idea. So because of his failure, God took the throne from him. And so now the great King Solomon is homeless and wandering in Israel. And that's when he writes this book. That could work, right? That's an interesting idea. In the end, we don't know. The source is an editor. Assembly. Kohelet, right? Someone who draws things together, an editor probably, who explores wisdom from the perspective of the seeming ephemerality of life. And I would say who the author is less important than wrestling with the questions Kohelet poses. We're going to pause here before we get into the book, because I just did a whole lot of world history. Questions, thoughts? Tony?
Well, let's read that mentioned concerns over expressions of hedonism.
Yes.
Could we look at a few of those passages?
Yeah, we will look at some of those passages. Yeah, I mean that's the whole beginning of the book. Is everything's vanity. It's all meaningless. So I just eat, drink, and be merry. If nothing really matters, just do what you want to do, right? Yeah. Others, questions, thoughts, Casey, and then John.
Just kind of, in your opinion, most of the people back then were not, you would say, couldn't read and write.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was only the few intelligentsia, the scribes and such. So they were just directing it to people. So the average person, like we are today, was not reading and writing, right?
Mhm.
Is that correct?
Yeah, and so the way most people experience scripture was they experienced it orally, Aurally. They listened to it read by the people who taught in synagogues as these scrolls were circulated. And so that's why people had a tremendous capability for memorization in ancient times as well, because they didn't have to read. They couldn't read, and so if they wanted to know what was going on, they had to remember these texts. Yeah, so they would have been hearing it read around. John.
Whether it was Solomon or whoever else, you kind of wonder if he was also kind of dealing with some mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
maybe some dementia.
Mm-hmm.
We just think of those as kind of later terms of into understandings, but like, well, that's kind of where my brain goes
Mm-hmm.
with this. Things with life is sort of in decline, whoever's it is.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think that, as we read through this, this does not sound like the work of a young man or a young person. So as we go through the actual text, I think we'll see some of that sense, and perhaps those present who are in a different season of life than other people might resonate perhaps a little bit more with some of this too. It's also Ecclesiastes is kind of held at a kind of arm's distance by Christianity and Judaism itself often. It had a real resurgence in the 20th century, though, when people with stuff like Nietzsche, deconstructionism, all of this sort of stuff, which was this like great heady stuff that was going on. And then, I mean, this could have been written in the 60s, right? It fits with a lot of that too. And so it became really interesting for theologians and scholars how fascinating that these deep wrestlings, because we always think we're the first people to go through this, right? And these deep wrestlings we're going through, that here it is, thousands of years ago, someone asking the exact same questions that keep us up at night. Good. Let's dive in. We'll start with chapter 1. If you got a Bible, you can turn there if you want. Chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. The words of the teacher, Kohelet, or preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hurries to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Round and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they continue to flow. All things are wearisome, no more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them. I, the teacher, when king over Israel and Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given human beings to be busy with. I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see, all is vanity and a chasing after the wind. So let's talk about words we can't translate. Oh, look, we've got another one. The Hebrew word here is hevel. Translated here is vanity, vanity of vanities. It's really hard to translate hevel. It could be vapor, breath, figuratively, insubstantial, vain, futile, meaningless. It literally is the hevel. It's right, that breathing, the sighing, that's where it kind of comes from. It's one of those words that the word is like what it sounds, kind of an onomatopoeia. The word is repeated no less than 37 times in Ecclesiastes, making its first appearance here and showing up again in chapter 12. Other translations than vanity, suggested by scholars, have been ephemerality, emptiness, meaninglessness, absurdity, and shit, according to Frank Krusman. That was what he translated it. Shit of shit. Everything is shit. Which is kind of not a bad translation, if you think about it, of what this person's trying to say. But emptiness of emptiness, meaninglessness of meaningless, absurdity of absurdity. You're getting kind of a sense of the breadth of the word that the author is trying to use here. You could think of it kind of as like a mirage, a fata morgana, in which all of our hopes and efforts and plans are kind of evaporating before the vicissitudes of life, right? That's what the preacher is seeing here with that. The cosmos here is a place of constant action, but one that doesn't seem to produce an end. There's no meaning to it. And similarly, humans invariably find themselves chasing after the wind. This is different than the picture of creation, which is presented in other texts, like in the Psalms, where creation is seen as this beautiful work of art, producing things. The author of Kohelet looks at creation and sees everything's moving and it's not doing anything. It's a clock running with no fruit that's coming out at the end of it. In verse 8, it says, all things are wearisome. The word there in Hebrew is divarim, which is the word for literally words, word or thing. So it could be all things are wearisome, or he could be saying all words are wearisome, which I think is a beautiful translation. And probably, as is often the case in Hebrew, he's using that double meaning very intentionally. All words are meaningless. Centuries before Isaiah had prophesied that God's doing a new thing, right? That's this great hopefulness of the post-exilic time. At this point, Kohelet disagrees. The idea that God's ever done a new thing, he's very skeptical of. So once again, think of the timing. So in the post-exilic world, they're coming back from the exile in Babylon, they're rebuilding the nation. God is doing a new thing. Lift up, rise up and shout. There's that hopefulness. Now fast forward a few hundred years, you have not rebuilt, you've not made Israel great again. And it seems like there's just every century or so, there's another empire conquering and then conquering and then conquering. So there doesn't be any new thing God is doing anymore. God is absent from Ecclesiastes. The cosmos moves on in its own frenetic inertia, human history mirroring its kind of lifeless movements. So you get a sense of kind of the general mood of Ecclesiastes. And so, yeah, people have suggested mental health. I think it also fits. I've talked to people who at the end of their life, this is kind of where they are. That they just kind of given up in some sort of way. That's what the preacher seems to be. And then I continuing with verses 12 through 18, I read the first part of this already. I, the teacher, when king over Israel and Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given human beings to be busy with. I saw the deeds that are done under the sun and see all is vanity, chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my mind has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a chasing after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. That phrase, chasing after the wind, the Hebrew there translated as chasing, can also be feeding. It's a feeding on the wind, which is a kind of an interesting image to use as well. So the world, having been aptly described as vanity of vanity or shit of shit, the teacher now finally introduces himself, which is kind of interesting, right? He says, so this is who I am, shares his royal accomplishments, who he's been, a king of joy and woe who searched out the meaning of life by traveling to the ends of the earth only to find no meaning. If you're familiar, that's the story of Gilgamesh, right? So when the stories of Gilgamesh were discovered, this is a Sumerian king. It's written in Akkadian. It kind of freaked out the world a little bit because it's so like the Bible, and it's not like the Bible. Oh, yeah, it's not like the Bible. And so the Epic of Gilgamesh is literally this really wise, powerful king who travels all over the world to find meaning, and at the end feels kind of hopeless at the end of it, which is kind of the story of Ecclesiastes. So it could be that the author here is drawing a little bit from the Gilgamesh epic, which would make sense once again if we're placing it when we're placing it. My point here, I don't think this is just a rewrite of Gilgamesh, because it is its own thing. But I think the bigger point is that this is a persistent feeling that's a part of the human condition without regard to time, century, religion, the feeling, the sense that the Kohelet has, the sense that Gilgamesh, the author of Gilgamesh, had, which was 1700 years before this time, because the Epic of Gilgamesh comes from before the 2000s. So that's just to acknowledge that. For Kohelet, though, the crookedness of the universe is impregnable. The universe cannot be molded to correspond to any human model, sense, or order. That even when we try to kind of take the world and we'll make it a better place, it seems like we just screw it up, right? And this is very much the experience of the 20th century. Early in the 20th century, we thought we're going to bring heaven to earth. There was all of this optimism about what we could do as a people. And then it just all fell apart. And we entered into a place of profound disillusionment. So I think Ecclesiastes is very much in that place. And what's really essential, I think, at the end here is this idea, for in wisdom is much vexation. Those who increase in knowledge increase in sorrow. So even wisdom becomes its own sort of folly in the end for Kohelet, which is kind of like, that's normally where you go to, right? When the world is hard, the scripture will continue to seek after wisdom. That's what holds the worlds up. Kohelet doesn't really think that's the case. Is really doubtful of that. Thoughts, comments? Yeah, Tom, and then Greg.
For me, it's important but hard to keep in mind that the teacher is kind of this guy that the author is listening to. And so, he's this critic, he's kind of sitting there talking to you saying, yeah, I've been there, I've done it all. It's all shit. Don't worry about it. And then, but that's not the author.
Yeah.
So the author is leading you through this guy's experience to make a point.
Yeah.
And that's hard to remember sometimes.
It is. And we'll get that when we get to the last chapter of the epilogue, where the voice shifts and it stops being Kohelet that's speaking, and it's someone now, the author, speaking of Kohelet. So the editor, who's actually the person behind the book, drawing all this together. I think that's a real good way of seeing a book like this, is to see this as what you described, Tom, as a conversation. And in a conversation, we should never be scared of as people of faith. But we should know that this is the place we find ourselves in sometime. And pretending that the world doesn't seem like this is not helpful to anyone. And so instead, let's dive deeply into this world, into that reality, and see what comes out the other end. That's great. Greg.
I like how you set context up with the worlds coming together for the first time. It seems there was a time when the wisdom that we pronounce was proper and effective and useful. But now what you have in verse 1 is why does that not serve anymore? It's not serve anymore because rather than just be resolute in our own understanding, we're now really called to study the arguments of others. You have to know what the Persians are doing. You have to know what the Greeks are doing to understand our own Hebrew argument of what we feel is proper. Is this despair come about because we're just not willing to listen, take the time, understand others? Is that the futility that? Because earlier history, wisdom were just fine.
Yeah.
When Persians are in their own world.
Yeah.
Zoroastrianism is great.
Yeah.
Greeks are in their own world. It's great.
Yeah.
And Hebrew in their own world, everything's fine. But now, for the first time in history, you have this movement, this early globalization, and that rocks everything. And I don't understand these people.
Right.
Rather than take the time to listen to them.
Yeah.
Let's be violent, or let's be forceful, make the rest of the world in our image. And that's where the problems come in.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the idea that we enter those epochs over and over again. Bethany and I are watching right now Shogun, which is fascinating, and it's so good. But what's hilarious is how the Japanese think this European is a barbarian. And when you watch from their perspective, yeah, he is kind of a barbarian. He doesn't bathe. He hangs this pheasant up and lets it rot before he wants to eat it. Like, this is a barbarian. From that perspective. And the same thing, we think of the globalization through things like the internet, how that has profoundly shifted things. So yeah, when these things collide, our sense of meaning becomes unmoored in some ways. It's its own thing. Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. Let's do chapter 3. Go to the birds a little bit here. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for war, and a time of peace. So there's 28 items presented in 14 temporal and antinomies. These are merisms. Merisms when you take two polar opposites to describe the totality of something. So they're kind of placed against one another as a totality of existence. What's fascinating, though, I think, about Ecclesiastes 3 is both the desiderata and the detestable have their place and the circumference of human existence in ways that religion is very often uncomfortable with, because we kind of want everything to be good and happy and peaceful. So the idea that that's not the case, at least according to Ecclesiastes in this text, no preference is given for one or another. What's needed is context. This is from echo of traditional wisdom. There's a time to keep silence and a time to speak, right? Wisdom is knowing what time you're in, right? I think you have to read the whole of Ecclesiastes 3 in the same way. This is a quote from that author of the interpretation commentary. Silence is not golden when the rights of the oppressed are at stake. Even hatred has its time, as seen in the imprecatory Psalms, right? Take the babies of the Babylonians and dash their head against the rocks, right? They're in the Psalms. So the idea that there are times for all things, and there are indeed times to tear. This was actually the central thesis of my capstone research project, my MDiv, where I talked about how the Reformation was mending the church through fire and sword. The church had become so irreparably broken that it needed to tear in order to find a new sense of truth. And so this, I think, is once again an interesting question, which is, uncomfortable for friendly Episcopalians who don't like to be grumpy or mean or say that there's a time to hate, there's a time for war. But I think it's actually very true, and that wisdom is knowing that when someone is in deep pain, that's not when you laugh. You need to weep with those people. But there are times when you wrap your arms around someone, and there are times when you give them space and let them be on their own. So this is, I think, what you're seeing here is in the sense of a kind of a meaningless world. What's fascinating to me is Ecclesiastes is still circling around wisdom is the way to navigate it. The Kohelet believes that what you need is to know, so what is the time I'm in calling me for? If everything is even meaningless. And perhaps the way I understand the seeming meaninglessness of life is by recognizing that maybe I'm in a different time than I thought I was in, right? Thoughts, comments? Push on, chapter 4. Talk about toil and justice, chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Again, I saw all the oppressions that are practiced under the sun. Look, the tears of the oppressed, and with no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, no one to comfort them. I thought the dead who've already died are more fortunate than the living who are still alive. Better than both is the one who's not yet been, who has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw that all toil and all skill and work come from one person's envy of another. This is also a vanity, chasing after the wind. Fools fold their hand and consume their own flesh. Better is a handful with quiet than two handfuls with toil and the chasing after the wind. So the teacher looks at oppression and dives into it as the social polarity between the oppressed and the oppressors, defined by who actually possesses power. That's what the Kohelet sees. The problem Kohelet finds is no one is willing to comfort, not in terms of like pat you on the back, but say it'll be better, but comfort that's of bridging the chasm between the powerful and the powerless. And moving from that beyond, even work feels meaningless to the teacher, who exposes the vainglorious abuse of work, where envy of what you do not have can subvert love of neighbor. So it sees that really in the end, the work that most people are doing is because they're envious of what other people have. Probably not terribly inaccurate, and that becomes its own sort of vanity, meaninglessness. At the same time, just sitting around doing nothing doesn't work. Idleness is self-consuming. Fools fold their hands and consume their own flesh. And so what you need is a balance, the challenge of finding a balance, new perspective of it all, which I think is beautiful. Better is one handful with quiet than two handfuls with toil and a chasing after the wind. You know, in the end, and this is, I think, a hard thing, particularly for American society to understand, because American society is rather addicted to work and production in ways that other societies are not. And I think there's something to be learned here. They're kind of saying it's better to just have one. You don't need two handfuls. Have one handful in a better life, rather than two handfuls and all this toil and chasing after the wind, right? So once again, he's finding meaninglessness, but still circling around wisdom as a way of trying to interrogate the supposed vanity or meaninglessness of life. Thoughts? All right, let's move into chapter 11. We're going to move towards the end of the book here. Chapter 11, beginning in verse 8. Even those who live in many years should rejoice in them all. Yet let them remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. Rejoice, young man, while you are young. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Follow the inclination of your heart and the desire of your eyes. But know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. Banish anxiety from your mind and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are vanity. So the book draws to a close. The teacher urges the listener to enjoy what exists in life, but sets that enjoyment within the context of God's judgment. So does believe at some level still that there will be judgment in the end if you don't enjoy life rightly. Even if I don't see that judgment happening now, when I look at the world around me, there's still that hope against hope that Kohelet seems to have, that things will be made right. And then close on the heels of that, of how to live a good life, the teacher turns to the reality of death explored through a variety of enigmatic images. So this is starting in verse 1 of chapter 12. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come, and the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return with rain, and the day when the guards of the house tremble and the strong men are bent, and the women who grind cease working because they're few, and those who look through windows see dimly, when the doors on the street are shut and the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. When one is afraid of heights and terrors are in the road, the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails. Because all must go to their eternal home, and the mourners will go about the streets before the silver cord is snapped and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the breath returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher, all is vanity. So this is a really kind of I think, a really poetic description of an aging body, is how interpreters often see this, or a crumbling house, kind of the slow breakdown of who you are, which happens as you get older. So this is one of the reasons why people often see something written by someone at the end of their life who's kind of experienced this slow breakdown and the sense of what that means for the world as it actually exists. At the height of one's prowess, both physical and moral, is celebrated under the light of the sun. So is the debilitating onset of old age and death, which is marked by kind of the darkening of the cosmos, as Kohelet describes it. That both have their place in existence. And the way to survive in the sense of vanity is recognizing when you've entered into it from a time to live into a time to die, right? And then we have the epilogue, the summary of the teaching in verse 9. Besides being wise, the teacher also taught people knowledge. You catch that? The person just shifted. This is not the teacher talking anymore. This is the invisible editor who we haven't seen until now, who's been hidden in the story. So besides being wise, the teacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs. The teacher sought to find pleasing words, and he wrote the words of truth plainly. The sayings of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings that are given by one shepherd. Of anything beyond these, my child, beware. Of making many books there's no end, and much study is a wearisome of the flesh. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including everything, every secret thing, whether good or evil. So most scholars think that this is written after the rest of the words of Kohelet were drawn together. So this is that later editor. This is maybe the only thing that modern interpreters agree at, is that the teacher didn't write these words. There's a lot of things people debate about this book, but this is one of the that clearly this is the work of someone else. And the epiloguist is kind of how they describe it. But the epiloguist says that the words of the teacher are not a haphazard arrangement, which is kind of how they can sometimes come at you, but this is a pleasing and truthful attempt to instruct. This does not mean that it is easy. And so I like the way it's described, that the sayings of the wise are like goads and nails, painfully prodding us about life's meaning. So if when you read Ecclesiastes, you find yourself kind of disturbed, that's the intention. That's the point. It's meant to push you, to prod you a little bit. Godly fear is underscored 4 times in this book, and reverence acknowledges the durability of divine power, produces a life of simplicity and moral integrity. And there's a lot of debate, though, in scholarship. Is this epilogue the lens through which you should read Ecclesiastes, or is this epilogue a later attempt to make Ecclesiastes a bit more palatable? Right? So what do we do? Fear God, keep his commandments. Oh God, good. So there is an answer at the end, right? To me, I fall in the camp of people who feel like that this is an attempt to fix Ecclesiastes that I don't know if is really needed. I kind of feel like the book stands on its own. You don't need this, so just go obey God and do the law and you'll be okay, sort of thing. This is a great quote here. I like, this is at the end of the author on Ecclesiastes who did the interpretation commentary that I thought was a helpful final word about the book as a whole. For Kohelet, the greatest secret is not the dark and turbid depths of the human heart, out of which innumerable schemes emerge, nor is it the indeterminate working of the cosmos, which for all toil seems to accomplish nothing. They all pale in comparison to the inscrutable other, who remains in heaven yet holds humanity accountable and offers every good gift. God is the enigma above all others, the sovereignty of majesty. So if you don't want to read that last section of Ecclesiastes as fixing the book, you could say that this is where the author ends, is that there's something about the enigmatic inscrutability of God, which is really all that we have in the end. Now, as much as I do think he's trying to fix it, I also like this answer too. This idea that in the end, all of these things we have, we're going to give meaning to life, are going to fail. And the complete otherness of God is all that exists in our relationship to that inscrutable otherness. This is the way of apophatic spirituality, which is such an important part of the spiritual tradition, particularly in Eastern Christianity. Western Christianity often tends to get freaked out by it. But apophatic spirituality, that we have to engage in the nothingness of God, the inscrutability of God, that going deep into the dark is actually the only way to find any sense of the light, I think is where Ecclesiastes is leading us. Perhaps. Questions, conversation. Yeah, Greg.
Does that not require, what I don't see here is the necessity to change and transform, transfigure, and that's an essential part of what we follow.
Yeah.
What I can read here is all this spiritual, just continue as you are.
Yeah.
But that's a different message. That's
Yeah.
the necessity of abandoning that old wisdom.
Yeah.
That old priority that you had.
Yeah.
And you have to change.
Yeah.
That's the learning that's gonna bring that growth and change. That's the necessity that, I don't read that here.
Yeah.
It might have been in the epilogue. I have to look at the epilogue.
Right.
Again, but here it's just be good, and that's so dissatisfying.
Yeah.
Because we're using our old eyes. We have to use a new eyes to understand where we are. And trouble comes when we don't want change.
Yeah.
We don't like change.
Yeah.
I preach the same things that I have heard before.
Right.
Don't ask me to change.
No, I think that's well pointed out. My guess would be what the author would say, at least the author of this commentary, is that it's not so much that we just throw our hands up, but it's the persistent wrestling with the inscrutable other. And you can't wrestle with the inscrutable other without changing. That would be my guess, is what he's saying. And so in some ways, the point of Kohelet, I think also is you can't live your life at the end of it where Kohelet is. You have to go through the whole journey of wrestling and exploring and finding, and then finding that didn't have meaning. So it's kind of one of those things where, when you're teaching someone in music, about how to break all the rules of music. When you're composing, you start having to learn the rules before you can learn to break. Same thing in art, right? You have to. It's same thing in literature, right? So you have people that will read, for example, a great author kind of defies the rules of literature, produces a great book, and then they'll try to just do that themselves, but they haven't yet learned the rules they're trying to break, so it kind of comes off very sophomoric and haphazard. I think it's similar here, that you've got to go through that journey of that wrestling to get there. Because I do think that there's a temptation that people have kind of read this and kind of move to that kind of, I just give up. I mean, I guess I'll try to fear God and follow the commandments, but nothing really matters. And I think that would be missing the invitation Kohelet offers. Because I do think that as much as Kohelet thinks everything is meaninglessness, there seems to be a deep wisdom in that discovery. It's like, I think I actually used this quote in my sermon this morning. The T.S. Eliot quote, that the end of all of our journeying will be to come back where we started and know the place for the first time. I think it's that constant wrestling with the inscrutable other. And I do think this is where, in my experience, the Christianity I was raised in was very shallow, because you don't wrestle with God. You just kind of read the Bible and do what the Bible says. And when I learned more about Christian spirituality, the history of which this Christian spiritual tradition is very much wrestling with God. I talked about this with Mac this morning, this idea that Mac did the prayers of the people, and he struggled a bit in the prayers of the people, given everything that's happened this past week. I said, I think my favorite descriptions of prayer is a great battle. And I think it can be. I think the spiritual life is that as well. And I think we do people a disservice when we tell people, come and be a Christian and you'll have kind of a happy, joyful life, as opposed to come to Christian, follow Jesus, and you'll be a part of a great existential battle for the meaning of life and the meaning of reality. That's not very appealing. I'm not going to put that on a billboard and have fill the pews at St. John's. But hopefully after coming a few Sundays, someone will show up at Faith Formation and hear that invitation. Because I do think that's the deeper invitation of the Christian faith. We got time for one more. Mac, you get the last word.
If you, any of you, but it's always been amazing to me that Ernest Hemingway took the title of the greatest novel from the first passage, The Sun Also Rises. And he also had beneath that, he had a quote, Vanity of Vanities, and then right beneath that, a quote from Gertrude Stein that said, "You are all a lost generation." This was the 20s.
Yeah.
The First World War. That he, and I think he's a great writer. I know he's in Eclipse right now. I think he'll come back. This was the kind of thing that spoke directly to him. And I've always thought too, the title, The Sun Also Rises. Well, who are you saying that to? In what situation? Sounds like it's pretty dark.
Yeah.
And you say, it'll also rise. But that's just, so now let's all go to the bullfights.
Right. Yeah.
Great, to Papa Hemingway.
Yeah. That's good. That's a good place to end. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Nancy. But Greg, yes, go ahead.
You that are so inclined, I have a card on the parish to send to Bishop Moody for her bravery, and she's my hero. So I have the card all for us to go.
See you, Nancy. Bye, Melissa.